This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of the Biggest Table podcast, I welcome Andrew Arndt, the lead pastor of New Life East in Colorado Springs, to discuss his experience in ministry, his love for the church, and his new book, A Strange and Gracious Light. Arndt shares his deep-rooted passion for the church, influenced by his upbringing during the charismatic renewal of the 1960s and 1970s. He reflects on seeing the church with clear eyes, acknowledging both its flaws and its beauty. The conversation delves into the importance of the church calendar, embodying the story of Jesus, and practicing hospitality. We also explore the challenge of avoiding a consumerist mentality in the church and the importance of embodying kingdom values in daily life. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Andrew Arndt. Andrew is the lead pastor of New Life East, one of 7 congregations of New Life Church in Colorado Springs, where he also hosts the Essential Church podcast, a weekly conversation designed to strengthen the thinking of church and ministry leaders. He previously served as lead pastor of Bloom Church, a neo-monastic, charismatic, liturgical, justice-driven network of house churches in Denver. He received his MDiv from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and DMin from Western Theological Seminary, and has written for Missio Alliance, Patheos, The Other Journal, and Mere Orthodoxy. He is the author of Streams in the Wasteland, All Flame, and A Strange and Gracious Light, which was just released on April 15th. He lives in Colorado Springs with his wife Mandy and their 4 kids. So thanks for joining me today, Andrew. It's great to have you.
So glad to be here. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah. So you've been a pastor for a number of years, if I'm not mistaken. And so, as you think and look back over decades of ministry, what comes to mind for you? I know it's a big question. We're just going to jump right in and sort of, curious what you've seen and witnessed. And
man, what comes to mind? I am hopelessly in love with the church. I'm a child of the charismatic renewal of the 60s and the 70s. So my parents were, and all their friends were like cradle Lutherans and Catholics, and then they started, they just kind of got swept up in what was happening in the United States back then. The power of the Spirit, and they planted a church in the late 70s, and that's the church that I grew up in, which was flag waving and tambourine, all the stuff. Yeah. But there was such a, it took me a long time to figure this out, but there was such a depth and richness there, precisely because even though they had kind of left their upbringing, they also brought it with them in important ways. And so they were just good-hearted people that knew the faith, and they were full of the life of the Spirit. And in a town of 18,000, our church was 600, 700, 800, just depending on the year that you pick or whatever, which is a pretty substantive community. And it was a community.
Yeah.
And it just taught me, I think it's funny because growing up in that kind of charismatic evangelical subculture, I can remember a dozen times answering an altar call in children's ministry to say the sinner's prayer or whatever.
Right.
And I remember that always being confusing to me because I was like, but I've always loved Jesus. Jesus, church, kingdom for me was always the realest real. And I think I knew from an early age that I wanted to devote my life to the church. And so went off to seminary, after college. And now here I am 20 years later after seminary. And so, when I look back on it, I think I'm more in love with the church than I've ever been. I really love it. I also think I see it with much clearer eyes.
Yeah.
I've seen how the sausage is made, and it's not pretty sometimes.
No.
And either we believe that there's a gracious God who's holding it all together and carrying us to a good conclusion, and whose grace outpaces all of our failure, or we think that this is just a huge waste of time. And I don't know. I keep deciding for the grace of God. I keep deciding for Jesus. the disciples thing in John 6, where Jesus is like, "Are you guys going to leave too?" And
Right.
they're like, "Where would we go?" That's kind of how I
Mm,
feel. I'm like, if you have chosen these people, and that includes me, I'm a hot mess,
right.
then I'm staying with it. It seems like this is your plan. I believe in you, so I'm sticking with you. So I see it with clearer eyes, and I think I'm more in love with it and more continually surprised by the grace of God than I ever have been.
That's amazing because it's easy, like you said, when you see how the sausage is made, it's either you want to completely reject it or you hold fast, and it's hard to find a middle ground.
Yeah,
Um, but what has sustained this love then for you? Like how have you continued to cultivate not only a love for
yeah,
Jesus, like, but a love for his community, his bride?
yeah. I mean, I've had plenty of times where I've been really frustrated and I've wanted to throw in the towel.
Yeah.
And I this is just going to sound stupidly simplistic to say, but I think God is what keeps me in it. And every time I'm like, I've had it up to here with these people and this thing and the institution, and I can't do it anymore. Uh, I keep going back to prayer,
Hmm.
and I keep going back to the scriptures. And when I read the scriptures, God, you can never, there's like, it's impossible to have a relationship with the God of the Bible in the abstract, in the void.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
nobody gets to just kind of wander off and sort of have their own private mystical experience, even if they do have moments like Moses in the wilderness or Elijah in the wilderness or whoever else, even Jesus goes to the wilderness. The God that they encounter there is always the God that's chattering at them about the rest of the people of God
Right.
and talking about his love for them and trying
Yeah.
to get them back in there because they've got work to do. And I just feel that so deeply. It's funny because, at the time of this recording, um, man, it's been a season for us
Hmm.
at New Life East that has not been easy by any stretch of the imagination. And I went, yesterday was church, and I got home from church and I kind of did my thing and ate some lunch and read for a little bit. And then it was finally sunny. It had been, we had like a week of snow and bad weather here in the
Yeah.
spring. So I was like, yes, I'm going for an evening walk, clear my soul. And I kept thinking as I went out on the walk, I was like, I'm just going to like unencumber my brain from all of the church stuff. And it's just going to be me and the Lord. And I got 30 minutes into the walk. And as I'm just in a space of the adoration of God, God keeps talking to me about the church. He keeps talking to me about these people. So,
Hmm.
and I just think that's covenantal,
Yeah.
like I just think that it's like one of my favorite theologians, the great Swiss theologian Karl Barth, basically says that in covenant, God, he takes his people to himself and
Hmm.
that doesn't break. So
Right.
you never get God by himself. You always get God and his people. And that's what the incarnation is telling us,
Yeah.
that it's like the two are together. So I don't know. I keep going back to this God who forgives my sins and is good to me and tells me to go back into these people and help them and be a part of what's happening there. And
Hmm.
where else would I go? I keep saying yes to that.
Okay. Yeah. No, I love it. It's always encouraging to hear perseverance stories and people who love the church and um, keep wrestling with, okay, what does it mean to be the church?
Yeah.
Um, and what does it mean to follow Jesus? And that's really like your new book, which is beautifully written, and you interact with so many different people, which I love. Like you're bringing in your
Mm.
charismatic, you're bringing in Karl Barth, you're bringing in John Calvin, like John Lewis. Like it's
All over the map.
you're all which is great, right? It recognizes the beauty of this diverse body that we're a part of, right? Like you're
Yeah.
not pigeonholed, but it seems this book is is a love letter about Jesus for your
Mm,
people. It seems,
mm, mm.
and so like while you love the church, you also see that we don't always get Jesus right. It seems, or we have a
Yeah.
smaller Jesus. So like can you help us understand or unpack like why this book at this specific time? Like, you know,
Yeah. 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 I think why this book at this specific time is an interesting question. I think I think I have been in love with Jesus since I was young, and I think I've been fascinated with Jesus since I was young. And I think, Andrew, one of the gifts that the charismatic tradition gave to me was that it didn't just give me a doctrinal Jesus.
hmm,
Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
So it didn't just give me a Jesus that was like, he lived in the first century. This is what we say and believe about him. But it gave me a living Jesus.
yeah,
That's to me, that's the essence of the charismatic expression, is that like God is here. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I heard us say when I was little, wherever two or three are gathered in the name, he's there in the midst of them. So it was this felt sense
Hmm.
that Jesus was in our midst, walking and talking and speaking and doing things. And that in some way that I didn't even have good language for at the time, Jesus, who he was, even the history of Jesus, like the story of Jesus. Like when
Right.
we read the Gospels, we didn't read them as like, wow, that's so cool. In the first century, he healed somebody.
Yeah.
When we read the Gospels, it was like, wow, he's healing somebody. So
Hmm.
like in that way, like the charismatic intuition created this sense that like the history of Jesus was contemporary with our own history.
Hmm.
And I didn't have good language for that at the time, but
Right.
I've since come to see in some of the great theologians, Barth's a good example of this. I mean, he basically, one of the themes that you see in his work is that in the same way that Jesus is like the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, his time is also the time of times,
Hmm.
which means that the story of Jesus is actually the meta story that wraps around and is contemporary with all of the stories. And so I think in 20 years of pastoral ministry, what circumstance and the weight of pastoral ministry have driven me into is this sense that when the New Testament says that Jesus is sufficient for all things, it must be true. So how and in what way is he sufficient for all things?
Hmm.
And what I've come to see is that this story of Jesus, and the story teases out the identity of Jesus, it's always enough for the church, and not just
Hmm.
enough for the church, it's more than enough for the church. And so as I'm trying to lead people into the fullness of truth, as I'm trying to lead them into that life and that more abundantly, John 10:10, the only resource that I've been given to do that is by saying, have we seen this one?
Hmm.
Have we seen the one who is the Alpha and the Omega? Have we seen the one who is the fullness of God? Have we seen the one in whom all the treasures of all the fullness of the Godhead dwells bodily, and all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge? Have we seen him? Do we know him?
Hmm.
And there's been a burden for 20 years just to give that away to people. So what's funny is you asked like, why this book right now? When I started writing it, I was really writing it as like a memoir slash meditation on like the art and the craft of preaching.
Okay.
Um, and I was working on my doctorate at Western Theological Seminary. So this was going to be my project. I was like, I've been preaching for 20 years. I think I might have something to say about it. Let's give it a
Right.
whack.
Yeah.
And I started writing about the art and the craft of preaching. As I got into it, I was like, I actually am less interested in how preachers say what they say. And I'm much, much more interested in what we're talking about,
Hmm.
and or at least what we're supposed to be talking about.
Right. Yeah.
And what we're supposed to be talking about is Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's not Jesus in the abstract, because I'm interested in what Jesus is doing, like
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
impact of Jesus on a group of people. And so then you have to talk about the church. So then the whole thing just became kind of like this. I'm just going to kind of show how a preacher might gospel their way through the ebb and flow of congregational life and the chaos of living in this moment in cultural history,
Right.
with the story of Jesus as his and their only hope.
Yeah.
And so that's where the book came from. So it was fun to write. A love letter to Jesus. Also, I mean, I dedicated it to our church, so a love letter to our church.
Yeah.
And I just feel like the fun of being the church is that we're tangled up for Jesus, for better or for worse.
Yeah. Right. And in it are the beautiful stories of what Jesus can and does
Yeah.
for your people. Like, you
Mm,
share amazing stories of what you get to
mm,
a front row to see. And that's sometimes the best part of being a pastor is you get to see what
yeah.
few people get to see in people's lives, for good
Yeah.
and for bad sometimes, right? Like sometimes
And yeah,
we have to make phone
if-
calls that are hard.
definitely. And I mean, you asked like, what keeps you coming back to it? It's that I keep seeing the Lord
Hmm.
in these moments that sometimes are just desperately hard.
Right.
And I go there and I go, I didn't expect Jesus to show up, but I just bumped into him again.
Yeah.
And now, like, what that's done is that has deepened my own appreciation, and
Hmm.
it's deepened my own understanding of who he is and what he does. So pastoral work can be like so exhausting, but I just think it's like Eugene Peterson would have said and did say over and over again, it's the middle of the action.
Right.
That's where, like, when we think about, like, we say the Nicene Creed, every couple weeks in our church. And one of the things I love about the Nicene Creed is that it's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, these great
Yeah.
affirmations, three big stanzas. But in the stanza on the Holy Spirit, there's not a break before it goes into the church.
Nope.
It just piles right into the church. And it's the creed's way of just gesturing at this idea that when the triune God's in the world, the church is the impact of that.
Yeah.
Of course, the triune God is up to much more than that, but the
Right.
most visible
Yeah.
place, like the densest place of presence, is surely the church. So it's
Hmm.
all that stuff, man. It just keeps me coming back when I'm just flat exhausted. And I feel like I'm at the end of it. Again, I bump into Jesus in the church and it keeps me coming back.
No, that's beautiful. And like you said, like stories matter and the story we tell matters. You have this quote, and it says, "That is quite simply what the story of Jesus is all about. The way in which God, by his Christ, gathers us up to himself and glorifies us with him in the midst of this world."
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you sometimes forget
Yeah.
what you write? You're like, oh, yeah, that was good. Huh?
Who said that? That's
Who said-
brilliant.
That's brilliant. But
Oh,
how do we keep getting the story of Jesus right? Because it seems in America, like having conversations and you see the polarization and you see this tug, of some people who want Jesus to serve their nationalistic ends, and you
yeah.
also like see progressive wanting Jesus to serve their ends.
Yep.
And so how do you seek to bring the fullness of Jesus so that like we don't get we don't make Jesus into our own image? Because that feels like the
Yeah.
greatest temptation is like how we constantly want Jesus on our terms. But
Man, that's yeah. That's such a question, such a great question. And maybe it's the question, how do we not turn Jesus into an idol of our own making, but we let him. Robert Jensen says somewhere that the difference between a living God and an idol is that a living God can still surprise you.
Yeah.
And so how do we keep positioning ourselves to be surprised by Jesus? I don't know. I think an answer to your question, I think one obvious way that we might go about it is just make sure that we're immersing ourselves in the life of Jesus, in the story of Jesus. And I
Right.
think Jesus, familiarity breeds unfamiliarity, which leads to contempt. I think that sometimes we're so familiar with Jesus that we actually lose sight of him. We don't, we become unfamiliar with him. And so I think plunging into the church has always said that the Gospels are the meat and potatoes of Christian spirituality.
Right.
And that's whether we're talking about a personal devotional life or the church's preaching. It's always that. And that's part of why also I'm sort of advocating for the church calendar in this book, because the church calendar is an annual immersive experience in the story of Jesus. And again, it's its own way of saying like, this is kind of the subject matter. This is what we should be talking about. So I think that's one big way. The other way though, is that I think you have to just bear in mind that we have this tendency to keep creating Jesus in our own image. And if you have that mental check, and I just think a lot of American Christians don't have this mental check.
No.
They just assume the Jesus that they've been given, and even progressive Christians, whether you're on the right or the left, they can have this.
Yeah.
But it's like this, we've just made too many assumptions. So I think that we should assume, because our minds are fallen just as much as every other part of us is fallen, that we don't get Jesus right. And we need to have our image of Jesus continually corrected. And how are we going to do that? Well, one way of doing that is just by being in the church, because the church will give us other perspectives that will stretch and clarify our sense of Jesus. But sometimes the church even can turn into a little echo chamber. It can turn into like these cultural enclaves. So a way that I have found that has been helpful is just reading outside of the cultural enclave. So I've done my best to read across the eras, read across denominations and traditions, read across cultures, and just make sure that I'm being confronted by Jesus in a lot of different voices. And that really helps me. And then even just like reading broadly.
Right.
And sort of searching for the face of Jesus in classic novels and poetry and even contemporary novels and other things like that. I want to hear what people are saying, because I assume that God is not just speaking in this tiny little place, but that he's speaking from a variety of angles to draw us into his life. So those things help me, but it's a real danger, isn't it?
No, it is. Because like we get stuck in our echo chambers, like not working in a church anymore. Like, as a former pastor, I had to deal with both sides. Now, not being a pastor, it's like I've noticed how easy it is to just fall in line with people I like, and not have. I think you also
I mean,
mentioned
I
that.
read with people. I mean, I try to read people that I disagree with.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, like, this is funny. Like, sometimes I'll have parishioners be like, I've gotten more judicious about this over the years, but I'll have parishioners, like, I'll quote somebody, you know, on
Yeah.
Instagram or something. And they'll be like, well, I heard that person said. So what
Yeah.
they're assuming is that I only read people that I agree with 100%.
Yeah.
And I just have to say to them, I don't agree with 100% of what anybody says.
No.
That's not the point of the reading, to
Yeah.
reinforce what you know. The point of the reading is to challenge and sharpen what you know. But for that matter, I don't know that I even agree with 100% of what I think.
No, right.
And that is why we should be open to other voices to challenge, because we realize, again, this is just a robust doctrine of sin. We
Right.
realize that we have vast blind spots and areas of deception. So I need other people to speak into that.
Yeah. And then that surprises us, because I think when we're open
Yes.
to the broad spectrum of, you know, where Christ can speak and be found, like, it continually surprises us. Like,
Yes.
oh, those charismatics aren't all bad and prosperity driven, you know,
Yeah.
people. Like, they're
Yeah.
beautiful. Like, being raised white, evangelical, conservative, like, I hadn't been
Yeah.
around a charismatic, and I got to spend 3 years in China being a youth pastor for missionary kids, which,
Mm.
and part of, I had a large swath of AOG people, and getting to know them and just to see the beauty of what a spirit-filled Christianity can be. You're like, oh,
Wow.
like, this is beautiful. Like,
And we have more in common than our differences,
yeah,
don't we? Sometimes it's just that we embody them. We
right,
embody, like, our way of being differently. Like, I can remember so I grew up charismatic, and then I went to a charismatic liberal arts college, Oral
okay,
Roberts University in
yeah,
Tulsa, Oklahoma. And for 100 different reasons, I knew that seminary, I needed to go somewhere else. So I went to a reformed seminary in Chicago. You mentioned it, Trinity
yeah,
Evangelical Divinity School. And we went to, while we were there, we attended a church that wasn't like, they weren't like anti-charismatic. They were just more like, you know what I
yeah,
mean? So kind of like right over the middle of the plate evangelical, which was, that's what we needed. And I remember being, you know, in small group Bible studies there,
right,
and we'd be studying the scriptures together. And then it was like we would end with a time of prayer. And I mean, this happened all the time. I hear somebody say, they'd go, you know, we'd be like in this real quiet space, and they'd be like, you know, when we were reading that scripture together, I just really, really felt like the Lord was, and they'd kind of like fill in the blank with it. And
mm-hmm,
I'd be like, and then that would constitute a release of grace in the moment, like
mm,
ministry in the
yeah,
moment, you know? And I'd be like, wait, that's what we were doing in our charismatic church. We were just louder
right, yeah,
about it and much more bombastic, but
yeah,
we were like trying to listen to what the Lord was saying, and then we were speaking it out and
right,
into. I was like, this is the same.
right,
It's just like style different.
yeah,
So that's what the exposure, you
right,
know, to others does. It shows us points of contact, and then it also shows us points where we need to be challenged.
for sure, right. No, I love that. Yeah, and sort of switching topics, because your book is structured around the church calendar. But I noticed you left out like one major chunk of which is called like ordinary time. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, what, because much of our life like
Yeah.
feels ordinary, right? And I think there's
Yeah.
something there. Like, what was the like? What, I'm guessing there was an intentionality.
Shoot, Andrew. Gosh dang it. I gotta
But
get on the phone with Harold Press.
no,
Let him
but
know.
but no, I'm curious. Like, like
Yeah.
there was an intentionality probably in it. Like, you can only write so much. Like,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
how do you see ordinary time then? Which is
Yeah.
in the church calendar, it's from Easter till the start of Advent for listeners who don't
Yeah, dude.
know.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so, like, how do you see ordinary time fitting
Yeah.
into your work?
Yeah, I love ordinary time. I mean, I like exciting moments like everybody else, and dramatic moments like
Yeah,
everybody else, but uh I think so much of the deepening of the work of the Spirit in our lives happens in all of the ordinary places that you just wouldn't notice or think are
right.
super spiritual. And I honestly, having grown up in that charismatic world, I really struggled with the idea of ordinary for a pretty long time, because I was conditioned to believe that unless your experience of God was like operating at peak level all the time, like you were
Yeah,
constantly at a 10, then something was wrong.
right.
And since then, I've just come to appreciate, Paul was like, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life,
Yeah,
and so much of the discipleship that's given to us in the scriptures is discipleship into the ordinary. I mean,
Yeah.
Proverbs,
Right.
Proverbs is like, so you've been filled with the Spirit. Now brush your teeth,
Right.
make your bed,
Yeah.
clean up your room. And you're like, I thought it was going to be more dramatic than this. And the Bible's like, well, yeah, it will be at times,
Mm-hmm.
but these things are actually the things that form a life, and you
Right.
need that. So why didn't I include ordinary time? I didn't include it because I was contracted for 50,000 words and I ran
Right.
out of time. But I think if I space it, but if I had to do it over again, I think it would make a great epilogue,
No, for
actually, to
sure.
just talk about the spirit in the ordinary and the way in which the story of Jesus encompasses the ordinary, which is an important thing to say and is maybe a little bit underexplored even in theology. Like these stories of Jesus are so compressed.
Yeah.
But when you look at them, there's a lot of space between them. It's like, well, one
Right.
Sabbath and then another Sabbath and another Sabbath, kind of like how the narratives are. Well, so
Right.
there's a lot of time
Yeah.
between there in which God, with all of the urgent issues of the world,
Yeah.
is not really doing that much at all.
No.
And surely that is saying something to us about also what it means to live a redeemed humanity. That the
Mm-hmm.
weight of the world doesn't need to rest on our shoulders. Like Jesus kind of lives a light yoke and easy burden kind of existence, and maybe we can too.
Right. No, I love that. Yeah. Uh, that there is a space in between which the God of the universe is just walking the streets with his disciples. And I think that's one of the beautiful things of the Chosen TV show is it shows us this
Yeah,
ordinary Jesus joking, having fun with his disciples. And you're like, oh yeah, like this
yeah,
isn't, he's not always healing.
mm-mm.
But
Yeah,
he's just going through life
yep, yeah.
at a different
Walking on
pace.
the walking on the road,
Yeah.
and I've said this to my church over and over again. I'm surprised at how much of the ministry of Jesus is a ministry of distraction. It's
Hmm.
like he kind of has like this broad outline of what he's wanting to do with his
Right.
life. He kind of knows like, okay, I got to get to Jerusalem and die. But beyond that, there's just like all of these. He's constantly like, well, somebody called upon him to do X, Y, Z, so he went this direction. And
Yeah.
again, what we're doing right here actually is what I've been doing in ministry for 20 years, and why this Jesus story is compelling to me, because I just think that it's all there.
Yeah.
I think that you can find it. So you're digging around in the Jesus story and you realize these kinds of things, and you go, like the core confessions of the church are not just that Jesus is fully God. So he's not
Right.
just showing God to us, but he's fully man. He's the
Yeah.
representative man. So human. So he's showing a true humanity to us.
Right.
So this is also, in a way, when we're reading Jesus, we're also reading something of ourselves. He's
Yeah.
giving us a vision of what life can look like lived inside the reign of God, with God as our Father. So yeah, ordinary time. I'll tell you what, man, if we get a second version of this,
Yeah.
updated and expanded, ordinary
Okay.
time is going all the way in there.
Perfect. No. Well, because I think for me, you said, like when you dig into the story of Jesus, you find things that surprise you, and like I
Hmm.
think for me, I was surprised when it was actually through Eugene Peterson in one of his books when he mentioned that the gospel writers are most fond of telling stories of Jesus around a table,
Yeah.
which is what that sentence has sent me into this lifelong journey of like,
Wow.
okay, what's the intersection of food and spirituality? And
Yeah.
you mentioned you write about Epiphany and
Wow.
that Jesus is upsetting the status quo through his teaching and healing.
Yeah,
And I would add, like, I think it's also through his dining habits that Jesus
definitely.
upsets the status quo because he gets more in trouble with who he eats with and who he's hanging around with. And so, like, how do you see hospitality to the table, and not just the Lord's table, but like as we take Jesus
Mm,
into the world, how does the table
mm.
function into who Jesus is for you?
Well, I want to see people open up their tables more, but I think that folks are skittish about this now.
Right.
It used to be that it was commonplace that you went and visited with your neighbors
Yeah.
or you invited a coworker over for a meal, but now I just think that we're living in a very it's like a socially anxious culture,
Yeah.
and we just don't know how to do this. We now are so deep in the social media revolution
Right.
that it's almost like we only know how to relate to with one another with our thumbs.
Yeah.
And surely that's its own kind of conditioning. So I think we have a real uphill battle to fight. And I think that we might need to explore some intermediate spaces with people
Mm.
before we get them at
Yeah.
the table, because the table is kind of a tall ask. So it might be that we
Right.
just need to take our coworkers to lunch
Yeah.
or we might need to, just grab the happy hour after work
Right.
or coffee time or whatever it is. So we want to try to come into spaces that are a little bit safer, and then we want to reinforce the safety of those spaces. I
Hmm.
think by our posture. And our posture, I think, has got to. Here is the thing that I mean, I just think the polarization of our culture is one of the evils of our age.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tearing us to pieces. It's
Yep.
like,
Right.
I'm just charismatic enough to say it's a principality and a power. And so, like, the weapons of our warfare are not
Yeah.
carnal, but they're mighty to the pulling down of strongholds. What might we do? Well, we might just consider a posture of compassionate curiosity
Hmm.
with our
Yeah.
coworkers and our neighbors, the people that are different from us. Just listen to them. Here's our story. Let things come out in the open. And as we see points of contact and also difference, learning to hold difference in a space
Right.
that's safe
Yeah.
can really help, like, rehumanize us. And then as the Spirit grants us opportunity, I do think just opening up our tables,
Yeah.
our homes, is such a big deal. So, like, one of the things that my wife and I do every year during Advent is we host a community brunch at our
Hmm.
house. And so we fling open our doors, we send out invites, and then we fling open our doors on a Saturday morning. And we tell people it's a potluck, so bring some stuff to share, 10 o'clock.
Right.
And we're all going to be together and eat some good food and drink coffee and catch up with one another. And you know how it is. I mean, you've got kids and you're in the
Yeah.
professional world, and our schedules are really full.
Yeah.
So once a year sounds like not very much, but it is astonishing to us how quickly that year rolls back around. If you tried
Right.
to do it once a month, it would be like untenable. And furthermore, Andrew, we tell people it's a 90-minute gathering.
Right.
So we go, this is going to be 10 to 11:30, so it's not going to take up your whole day.
No.
And I'm not going to try to lead an awkward discussion.
Mm-mm.
And I'm not trying to sell you the gospel here. That's not
Right.
happening here either.
No.
We just want you to come and get to know your neighbors and feel safe. And the upshot of it is that the people who are believers in our neighborhoods are getting to know these folks who are not believers and inviting them to
Right.
church. And some of them are coming to church and coming to faith, and awesome.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to center in that. I'd love that what you're doing with the biggest table is so cool to me, because when you look at the history of the church, one of the things that you realize is that hospitality really was the church's evangelistic strategy in the first
Right.
few centuries of the church. So we think of hospitality as a nice dinner party with friends,
Yeah.
but the church thought of hospitality as the practice that you must engage in, because this God has opened up God's own life to us. God is hospitable.
Yeah.
The reconciliation that takes place in Jesus Christ is fundamentally an act of hospitality whereby God overcomes the differences
Right.
and he brings us home. And so what would Christians do if that story was true? Well, they might sit down with people and eat with them.
Exactly. Yeah.
And see what the Holy Spirit did with that.
Right. Yeah. And we practice hospitality because in doing so, we might be entertaining angels unaware. Like
Yes.
we never, like, I think for me, and so long it was like, okay, I'm hospitable so I can show Jesus to the world. But what if the
Right.
better question to ask is, who can Jesus be for me and who I entertain?
Yeah.
Like, where can I meet Jesus? Like, Matthew
Yeah.
25 isn't taking Jesus to the prisons, it's recognizing Jesus
No.
in the prison.
Oh,
Um,
man.
and so it's
Wow.
like hospitality has to re-engage this, okay, where can I meet Jesus? Because if
Yeah.
Jesus, like your book says, if Jesus is everywhere
Wow.
and is uplifting this world and is filling this world, like there's no place we can go where it's not, his holiness isn't
Yeah.
prevalent.
That's
Like
right.
hospitality
Uh,
is no longer a yoke of me taking Jesus, but of, okay, where is Jesus going to show up for me today?
It's like entering into the hospitable flow of whatever the
Yeah.
Spirit's doing. You know what the coolest thing to me about that parable is, by the way, um, is that the righteous are so conditioned to be hospitable,
Right.
and do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to just show kindness
Right.
to those that are on the outside, that they don't even. It's not that they didn't recognize Jesus.
Right.
More fundamentally, they didn't even know they were doing it.
Yeah.
And that is a thing that I think we
Mm.
must fight to reclaim in our discipleship. It's sort of like the people that are really good at prayer are
Right.
praying all the time, even when
Yeah.
they don't realize they're praying.
Right.
And I think that's a thing that the church can recapture. That it's
Mm.
like we're hospitable, we're kind all the time, and we don't even know that we're doing it. So
Yeah.
that when Jesus says to us, you did it for me, we go, when did we didn't even realize we were doing it because it was so in our nature to do.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, it's not about setting a nice table. It's not about laying out my best china and having a Martha Stewart table.
Yeah.
But it's okay. Who is Jesus? Who can I bring? Who can I be for this neighbor today? And who can I bring a presence of welcome today, and be a person of belonging?
That's right. And what does this moment require of me?
Yeah.
And it's not some standard that I'm trying to fulfill. It's just I'm trying to be responsive to the moment, because even the call to hospitality can become a kind of burden
Yeah.
that we place on ourselves, where it's like, well, was I hospitable enough?
Right.
And I don't think that the Lord wants us to carry that either. I just
No.
think he wants us to go, did you just see what I was doing in the moment? Just do what the moment demands.
Right.
And watch what I do with that, and you don't have to judge yourself around this. Just go, be there.
Right.
Like where I am.
Yeah. Be consistent, be present,
Yeah.
be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, man. Great advice.
Right. Well, I'm in wine sales, and I'm not a sales guy. But when I was getting hired, people are like, my company was asking, like, can you be consistent? Can you show up? And can you listen? And I was like, yeah, I think I can do that. And like,
Wow.
great. And
Wow.
you start to see it pay off. Like, did it happen overnight? Sales? No. But like over time, I've showed up, I've been consistent,
Wow.
and without forceful, and people respect that.
Yeah.
And so I think, you're like, okay, evangelism doesn't have to be a used car salesman technique.
Yeah.
I just got Andy Root's new work. I don't know if you're familiar with Andy Root's work, or
I'm
read
familiar
him.
with him. Yeah, but I don't know the new book.
Evangelism in the Age of Despair.
Oh, wow.
Like just reading the introduction, and I think it ties into your work because of like, he argues that we've been so inculcated to this pursuit of happiness that evangelism has turned into a pursuit of happiness. That really, whereas evangelism is entering into a ministry of consolation where we meet each other in our sadness. Because Jesus is a man of sorrows. Which I think that's what your book is engaging us is to do, is like, okay, how do we meet the Jesus who is crucified?
Yes.
Not this triumphal Jesus, but the Jesus who is crucified and meets us in our sorrows.
Well, that's the cool thing to me about the church calendar again, and like what it's doing is that it's giving us a Jesus in so many different modes.
Right. Yeah.
So who meets us in all of the different experiences of being human. So Advent gives us a Jesus that's on the way.
Yeah.
And Jesus gives us, and Incarnation Christmas gives us a Jesus that's closer than our very skin.
Yeah.
And Epiphany gives us a Jesus that's throwing over the tables. Lent gives us this Jesus that's like abandoning power. Good Friday gives us a Jesus that's entered into the pit with us. So what's cool is that, the human experience is pluriform.
Yeah.
It's not one thing.
No.
It's so many different things. And because Jesus has taken on our whole humanity, he meets us in all of those places, which is great for us in our evangelistic efforts.
Right.
Because what it does is it gives us eyes to see that we don't need to just like, growing up in the charismatic and evangelical world, when we preached the gospel to people, it was always just about death and resurrection.
Yeah.
As though mere atonement or only atonement were the only thing that a person needed.
Right.
But what you see when you look at the whole story is that Jesus comes to us in all these different modes, which liberates us to be like, maybe the way that you need to hear the gospel today is that Jesus is in the pit of despair with you. He's gone there with you as the forsaken one. Or maybe what you need is that your life has kind of flattened out with hopelessness and there's no life left in it. Well, maybe the Jesus that you need to meet is the Jesus who pours out the gift of the Spirit upon you. So you know what I mean? Like it allows us in our conversations with people to be nimble and to apply the medicine of the gospel in just the way that it needs to be applied.
For sure.
To the people that we're talking to.
Right. And not 7 steps for a healthy marriage.
That's right. That's right. But Jesus, look at the face of Jesus and here see him. Yes, exactly.
Right. No, I love that. Because, and this is where, you're a pastor, your livelihood depends on being a pastor and preaching. But do you ever think that the evangelical culture we need to rethink what we do for church, or like that church needs to shift, or like, because I think preaching has its place, but also like we're so inculcated, like you said, with digital media. We have 5 hours a day of Fox News or CNN or just reading headlines, and
like news is just.
I'm anxious, with the news today. And so like how can the church and how can Christ's body be something for people in the throes of what our culture's throwing at us, literally, from political upheaval to racial upheaval, economic upheaval, right? Like everything is an upheaval right now. And so like, how do we use Sunday, but also have a church that is more than just a Sunday, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a couple things. I think one thing is this is part of the reason that I think the church has to go back to its deepest roots of the faith. And so we have to go all the way back, not just to the Gospels, but to first, second, third, fourth, fifth century patterns, and then try to see how those patterns have endured over 2,000 years
Right.
of church history. And then we need to try to be the church in ways that are consistent with those patterns. I think that's part of what it means to have the house built on the rock. It's a sturdy foundation, and we have endured some storms of late as the church in this culture. Sometimes I just listen to Christians talk, and I think they're a little too rosy about the future and where the culture is going. And I go,
Right.
I think that there are storms to come. I just think that there are like waves still. So what are we built on? What's the house built on? And I want it built on the most substantive things. The other thing, so that's all of the gospel truth, and that's the great tradition. We know what we're talking about. But I think that those things also need to be embodied. And what modes does embodiment take? Well, one of the modes is it's our worship. It's what happens when we gather together. And in the evangelical church, I think we place a lot of weight on having an experience in worship.
Yeah.
And then 45 minutes of somebody talking at you. And I'm not sure if that's enough. I think we certainly need to sing.
Yeah.
And we certainly need to have an experience, but our worship it should embody those great things that we are about. And it shouldn't just be about an experience, but it should also be a place where we're offering up prayer together. Like different kinds of things are happening that are rooting us and grounding us in a kind of kingdom humanity, And then, man, I'm just going to get in trouble for saying this, but I can't listen to that much preaching anymore. Because I just think a lot of it is like, we're just talking way too much. And this is going way too in the weeds about practical life, this and that. I just think the mystery has to keep getting put in front of people. And then we have to keep calling people to the promise of the gospel and the commands of the gospel and saying, this is all that's given to you. And this is what is required of you. And we have to say that over and over again. And then we have to try to work really hard to create communities that are good communities of care.
Yeah.
Where people are not just coming to a flashy thing that happens on Sunday, but there are so many different points of contact. And it's, again, talking about the body, it's an embodied in terms of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
They're fully integrated in the body of Christ. And that is very difficult to do.
No, it is.
Because of the sheer level of distraction and mobility of our culture. And also because we're living now in such a consumerist church milieu.
Yeah.
That people get offended and they go, oh, okay, well, what I'm supposed to do is I'm supposed to go find another church.
Right.
They don't even entertain the idea that might be the wrong approach. They actually think they're doing the right thing by going to another church. They're like, well, that church is unsafe. I'm going to unfriend them, cancel them.
Yeah.
They don't, the call, like the ancient monastic vow of stability, which is rooted in just what it means to be the body, is like totally lost on people. So, it's an uphill battle, man, for sure.
Right.
It's an uphill battle. There's so many forces against us.
There is. But like you said, and you quoted John Lewis of like, we live, what's the actual quote? Just because I want to make sure, because it's
as though it has already happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As though it has already happened. And, I talked with Malcolm Foley, who has a new book on the anti-greed gospel. And he wrote like that, our job isn't to change the world, but that to recognize that Jesus has already changed the world.
Bingo.
And that's sort of what John Lewis is getting at too, of like, okay, we live as though it's already happened.
Yeah.
And inspiring that hope is really, it is challenging.
Wow.
But I think that's that's the
Wow.
call, right? Like that's what we're
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know what? It didn't make it into the book on the John Lewis thing was that in that interview with Krista Tippett, one of the things that he talked about was he talked about how in the middle of all that civil rights stuff, one of the things that they would do is they would set up these they would set up these situations where you would like train for the scenario. So like they would train you in like what to do if the police are mistreating you
right.
or if you're getting hosed down or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so and so you were trained in what the response was supposed to be, you were trained in what to say and what not to say. And so that when the moment of crisis came and the stakes were high, it was in your body.
Huh. Oh wow.
And like you knew what to do.
Yeah.
And the analog there with the church is obvious.
Yeah.
So you had to believe it was already done. Like it is finished.
Yeah.
Jesus has done it. You know
Right.
what I mean? And yet when we gather together and there is still this like battle raging and we
Right.
still are in contested territory. So what is the church? Well, the church is the place where we like practice the reality so that when we get in the situation, we know how to be. And that's where, to your point, where you're like, do you ever just look at the church and you're like, oh gosh, we got to do better? Yes. The church has to be this place where there's like so many levels, like there's a depth of training that takes place so that when people are in the world and they're up against it,
Right.
it's in their bodies. They know
Yeah.
what to do and they know
Right.
how to be.
Yeah. We've practiced having the hard conversations. We've practiced what it means to love, and we practice what it means to be uncomfortable.
That's right. We know how to not be flustered by our neighbor who tells us that, that expresses some political opinion that we really, 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 really disagree with.
Yeah.
Because in the church, we've practiced those kinds of conversations. So it's easy now that we're out in the world. It's not the first time we've had that conversation.
No. Easier said than done, but
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is like the vision of the church in the New Testament is one of beauty and glorious, and it does keep me hopeful, because pastors get hurt by the church way more than we want to admit. But to still love the church and to say, okay, no, this is how God has determined we are going to show Christ to the world.
Yeah.
There's something beautiful about that, and yet so hard and frustrating. And yeah, to hear from you and to hear that you still love the church is always brings me hope. So thank you.
Wow. Well, you're welcome.
As we begin to wrap up, it's a question I ask all of my guests. What's the story you want the church to tell?
Oh, wow. Wow. We tried it. And it works. Jesus is sufficient and more than sufficient for all that we will ever face. And I want them to say that especially to the next generation.
Yeah.
That's about to enter into the struggle.
Right.
And wants to believe it, but isn't sure. I want them to go, you can trust it. You can throw your life into it. It works.
It works.
It probably doesn't work the way that you think it's going to work.
No.
But it works. This is the truth. Yeah, I think that's a great question, man. I think that's what I would say.
I love it. It always provides a great summary too, but it's always surprising to hear what people say, and to hear you say that you want a new generation to hear that we have tried it and it works.
Yeah.
I think, what that would look like and what that would mean in this climate that we find ourselves in, that where it feels so polarizing, so unstable.
Yeah, man. Don't you just want the church to be a place where it's like you open it's not perfect, but you want it to be a place where it's like you look in and you're like, oh, that's what it could be.
Right.
That's how we could be.
Yeah.
Like, it's like the church is when you look into it, you're going, the kingdom of God. And that's the New Testament. Paul says that when y'all are together and you're worshiping, praying, and prophesying, if somebody doesn't believe, winds up in your midst, won't they fall down on their faces and worship God, saying God is really among you? That's what I want from my church. I just want it to be a place where it so looks and feels like heaven. The atmosphere is so thick with heaven that you go, oh, this is what it is.
Yeah.
This is how God made us to be. Like,
Right.
it's like you're not, it's not just that people are talking about the gospel, it's that you're seeing it. That's what I want.
No, for sure. And it may push us out of places we're used to being in,
Yeah.
but it might still be exactly what we need.
Yeah, exactly.
Because
Yeah.
we may not have the power or the prestige or the position we once thought possible, but I think, to show
Yeah.
people a glimpse of heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where we can exhale,
Yeah.
but then also still be moved towards compassion and justice towards the rest of the world.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yes. Amen. I agree.
yeah, may it be so.
Mm-hmm.
And then some fun questions to have a little fun because we've had a heavy
Yeah.
conversation. Some fun
Yeah.
questions about food. What's one
Okay.
food you refuse to eat?
Brie cheese. I won't do it.
And I thought we could be friends.
I can. I can go for funk, man, but there's some kind of funk on there that I won't do.
Okay. So you can do some funky cheeses, but not like brie?
Yeah, man, but not that one. There's just something about it that, like, the revulsion thing, like, just is real high with me on that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a no. It's a hard no.
All right. Good. Yep. All right. My wife and I love cheese, and I love stinky cheeses. Like,
Yeah,
give me a good stinky cheese, and I'm in heaven.
I'm
But
with you, but not that stank. I don't do it.
okay, that's fair. Then on the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Do you know, I've always told people the best bite of food, the best single bite of food I ever had in my life was at this gourmet burger bar in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the burger they called it the 60/40 burger. So it
Mm.
was like the patty was like 60% a mix of like sirloin, chuck, and something else, ribeye maybe. And then 40% was bacon.
Oh,
And so then they cooked it perfectly. And then they
yeah.
topped it with 3 slices of applewood smoked, like candied bacon, with
Mm.
a smoked cheddar cheese and like this beautiful mustard thing that they had created on a brioche bun. And I'm sure that you've experienced this before in your life. It's really a blissful experience, but
Yeah.
I bit into it and it was so tasty that I didn't want to chew it. I
Mm.
was like trying to figure out a way to freeze that moment
Yeah.
in time. It
Yep.
was so delicious. So, and it was good to the last bite. That was the best bite of food I ever had.
That's awesome. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're not paying me to say this, but if you're ever up in the Twin Cities area, the Red Cow, the 60/40 burger, it'll change your life. It's like a conversion experience. It's crazy.
Okay. Yeah. There's something about a good burger that can just do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Like a good burger is one of those foods that I could just eat all the time. I can't because I would feel horrible about myself.
Yeah. I
But
mean, it's okay. Tell my family I consider a day a failure if I haven't eaten a bacon cheeseburger, so I don't
yeah,
always win on that one, but
that's fair. Yes. No, I've had some bites like that too, where you're just like this I want this bite
Yeah.
forever, and I feel like there's some spiritual correlations with that. But
It felt like eternity or something.
yeah,
It's like just on the cusp of heaven. It was amazing.
yeah, yeah. Jesus breaks through. Jesus surprises us.
Yeah, he did. He totally did. Uh,
And then finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one last meal to enjoy, what would it be? And so if Andrew had one last meal to enjoy, what would be on your table?
yeah, man. I mean, I'd be eating that 60/40 burger.
Okay,
Yeah,
nice.
that would be it. And then my wife makes like a triple chocolate cake.
Hmm.
I don't really eat sweets anymore. It's like
Okay,
a thing in my 40s. I've like kicked sugar and carbs and all this stuff. But I mean, if I gotta die, it's
yeah,
60/40 burger and my wife's chocolate cake, and that's the end. That's the end.
sounds good to
I'm
me.
done.
Yeah,
I did
right. Yeah,
it.
yeah. You don't got to worry about any repercussions, any heartburn, any
No,
bloat.
the
No,
inflammation that's gonna come and the
no.
bloating, it really doesn't matter. I'm gonna die. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's what I'm eating.
no. Perfect. I love it.
Yeah.
Awesome, Andrew. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Really appreciate your heart for the church, for Jesus. And if people want to learn more about your work or find other stuff about you, is there a place they can find you?
Yeah, I've got a couple different books that you can find on Amazon. The one's right behind me. It's on the Desert Fathers and Mothers, so kind of the
Yeah.
proto monastics. I wrote that a few years ago. Really fun book. And then I wrote a different one a couple years before that called All Flame, which was like an exploration of how the Trinity forms us, and particularly looking at how the Trinity comes to us in sorrow and suffering. And that was a really meaningful book to write. It was super personal. But they can follow me on. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook or X or whatever it is. The Andrew Arndt is where you'll find me on X and Instagram. Andrew Arndt on Facebook, and then I'm on Substack too. I've been doing that, so they can look me up on Substack and follow my writing there. Yeah,
perfect. And then your podcast as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
awesome.
the Essential Church podcast.
The Essential Church podcast. So awesome. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Andrew, so much for this conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, man.
No, it's been a privilege. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.